chapter, we will examine how government price controls affect resource allocation in markets. We'll look at price ceilings, which specify a maximum price that sellers are willing to charge. And we'll also look at price floors, which set a minimum price that buyers are required to pay for a good. In this example, we'll show how a government price ceiling affects our market for apartment rentals. Okay, initially we start with our demand relationship that shows the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded in our rental market. So we start with our demand schedule, which shows that when the price is relatively high, $1,400, the quantity demanded is 1.6 million apartments. When the price goes down to $1,000, the quantity demanded is 2 million. When the price is $600 per month, the quantity demanded is 2.4 million. And we can plot these on our graph. We're plotting price on the vertical axis, quantity demanded on the horizontal axis. So we have 1,400 is the price, 1.6 million is the quantity. This gives us our first point. Second point, when the price is 1,000, the quantity demanded is 2 million. The third point, when the price is 600, the quantity demanded is 2.4 million. So when we plot our demand schedule in this graph, we get, and basically fit a curve through these points, we get a linear demand curve in this apartment rental market. Okay, now when we look at the supply side of the market, when the price is relatively high, the quantity supplied is relatively high. And when the price goes from 1,400 to 1,000, the quantity supplied decreases to 2 million. And when we decrease the price further, the quantity supplied decreases. So if we plot these, when the price is relatively high, the quantity supplied is 2.4. When the price is 1,000, the quantity supplied is 2. And when the price is 600, the quantity supplied is 1.6. So you can see that if market forces are operating, if the price is above $1,000, say 1,200, you're going to have the quantity demanded is going to be less than the quantity supplied. So you're going to have this surplus at a price of $1,200. If the price is below $1,000, say 800, here the quantity demanded is going to be more than the quantity supplied. So you're going to have what's known as a shortage. And if competitive market forces are operating, if there's a shortage, buyers are going to realize that if they want to rent an apartment, they have to be willing to pay more. So price is going to adjust upward. If there's a surplus, sellers are going to realize that if they want to rent their apartment, they're going to have to take less. So there's going to be a downward pressure on price. So if market forces are operating, we're arguing that the market price is going to adjust to $1,000 per month, and the equilibrium or corresponding quantity is going to be roughly 2 million apartments. So this would be the price and quantity if market forces were operating. Now we can analyze the impact of a price ceiling. Here we place a price ceiling at a price of $80 per month. And at this price, the quantity supplied is only 1.8 million. The quantity demanded at this price is 2.2 million. So there's going to be a $400,000 unit shortage of apartments, meaning that there are going to be more people that want to rent an apartment, more buyers than there are apartments available at this price, the price of the price ceiling. We could also show if we put the price ceiling in above the equilibrium price, it would have no effect because the market price would only go up to this point. So now we look at, well, what is the impact of this price control? And economists argue that price ceilings create shortages, meaning that at the level of the price ceiling, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So there are more buyers or sellers, and that's what you mean by a shortage. At the existing price, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. And if we introduce our efficiency analysis, we can look at what happens to total surplus, the sum of producer plus consumer surplus, when we have a price ceiling in effect. And what we're going to show is the sum of producer plus consumer surplus decreases when we impose a price that's other than the equilibrium price. So here's our market again for rental apartments, and we see the equilibrium price is $1,000 a month in our example. The price ceiling level is $800. And analyze, well, okay, at this level of the price ceiling, there are only going to be 1.8 million apartments rented, because this is the number that suppliers are going to be willing to place on the rental market. And you say, well, oh, okay, well, how does that affect our producer plus consumer surplus? Well, the consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve, the quantity that's going to be produced above the price line. So this would be our consumer surplus, area under the demand curve over to the quantity that's consumed above the price line. This is consumer surplus here. And producer surplus is the area above the supply curve over to the quantity that's consumed that's below the price line. So this is producer surplus. So we can see that in this example, consumer surplus went way up, basically because consumers were paying a lot less for their apartments. Producer surplus went down because landlords weren't able to rent the apartments for as much. And there is this dead weight loss. So the dead weight loss is basically the loss in consumer plus producer surplus that results from this price ceiling. So here, when you kept the price artificially low, some landlords weren't willing to rent their apartments. And the result was a loss in consumer plus producer surplus. So you can see from this analysis, with this dead weight loss, that economists would argue that this is not an efficient allocation of resources. Now, so here we show that at the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, this consumer surplus plus producer surplus would be maximized. And when we put the price ceiling in effect at $800, it decreases the quantity of apartments that are rented. And we see that there are some potential renters that are willing to pay more than what the price ceiling is. So we wind up with this dead weight loss that we looked at in the previous slide. And if you think about this, you know, what it shows is that, well, okay, if I was lucky and got to Craigslist in San Francisco, and I might only be willing to pay $800 or a little bit above $800 for this apartment, while there was somebody that was willing to pay $1,100 for this apartment in San Francisco. But because of the price ceiling, the rent control, the landlord could only charge $800, and I, the lucky one, who got the Craigslist first and had my resume online, was able to rent this apartment for $800 when I may have only been willing to pay or able to pay a little bit more for that. And the person that was willing and able to pay a lot more for that didn't get an apartment in this scenario. So it's like I'm the guy that was the lucky one, and the other person that had the job at Google that was willing and able to pay more didn't get this apartment. So essentially this rental apartment may not be allocated to the consumer that was willing to pay the most for it. And what we see that is, if we break down consumer plus producer surplus, what we find is that consumer surplus increases a lot because this is the new consumer surplus. So consumers overall are better off, at least if you were one of the consumers that's able to get the apartment. And producer surplus is lower because landlords aren't able to charge as much for the apartment. And some landlords decide to keep their apartments off the market. So this is essentially the argument. And in our team exercise, we're going to look at articles that relate to San Francisco, look at their rent controls, look at in totality why the rent controls are in place, what effect they're having, and look at how Airbnb affects some of the equation. So it's a topic that we're going to expand subsequently in our teamwork. And you can argue that the artificially low rental prices in some markets may decrease the supply of rental apartments. In other markets, like San Francisco, where the downtown market is pretty much built up, where there aren't that many new apartments becoming available because of the land constraints, the rent controls may not affect the quantity of apartments supplied in that particular market. So on one hand, you can argue that it's the wrong price signals, but what it does, it definitely advantages existing tenants in apartment buildings, and it disadvantages the landlord. It doesn't allow the landlord to jack up rents in a way that the market might be willing to bear at any given time. And you can argue that tenants may have rights, landlords may have rights, and that this is a policy question that's open for debate. Controls do have unintended consequences. If there's a shortage of a particular good and suppliers are limited to a certain price, for example, when the hurricane knocks out gasoline supplies at New Jersey gas stations, Hurricane Sandy, should the gas station be allowed to increase the price arbitrarily high, knowing that because of the supply disruption, there isn't going to be enough gas available for everyone that wants it? Should retailers be allowed to charge $5 a gallon or $10 a gallon or $15 a gallon to desperate consumers trying to run their generators, for example? Or should the government come in and limit the excess profit that those retail gas stations can accrue because of the supply disruption? And if I'm a gas station owner, would I have an incentive to violate the price control, the price ceiling, and sell gasoline out the back door to customers at a higher price than the maximum allowed price. Now again, we can debate the economic efficiency of price controls, but usually if it's a short-run, short-term price control, because of that, it gets to be an equity issue. Should producers that are fortunate enough to have gas supplies be allowed to gouge consumers and get the maximum they can per gallon? And again, it's a public policy question. And when prices are held artificially low, over time, does that provide an incentive for sellers, not to keep up, if, for example, an apartment that was rent controlled. If they can rent the apartment easily and have a backlog of people that want to rent, do they have an incentive to maintain and to fix up that particular apartment? And over time, what impact might that have when you impose longer-term price controls? Again, a question for policy debate. Yeah, in some situations, price controls can result in black market situations. If you go to many foreign countries and try to exchange your U.S. dollars for local currency, the official bank rate, for example, in Argentina and other countries, the official bank rate, exchange rate, is much less than you can get in the, quote, black market or on the street, because there are capital controls in those countries, and people that want to travel or people that want to exchange their Argentinian currency for U.S. dollars are limited in the amount that they can do that. Students studying abroad are limited in the amount of U.S. dollars that they can convert. And more people want to convert the Argentinian currency to U.S. dollars, they're going to be out there on the street trying to buy dollars from tourists. And the exchange rate that you get there is going to be higher than what you're going to get in the official rate through a bank. Okay, now we're going to look at price floors, which are price controls that set a minimum price that buyers have to pay in the market. And we're going to look at what types of situations result in these types of price floors. The minimum wage is one of the most common price floors that are in existence in most industrialized countries, at least. Another common examples of price floors is in agricultural markets. The government comes in and establishes a price floor for milk and other agricultural commodities. And when the price is relatively high, when the price is $1.40, the quantity demanded is 8 million, relatively low. And if we plot this point, when the price is for $1.40, the quantity demanded is 8 million. When the price goes down to $1, the quantity demanded increases to 10 million. And when the price goes down further to 60 cents a pound, the quantity demanded increases to 12 million. And schedule shows the relationship between price and the quantity demanded. And if we plot that and fit a curve through it, we get this linear demand curve, in this case for butter. Now we look at the supply side of the market. It shows the relationship between the price of butter and the quantity that producers are willing to supply. And when the price is relatively high, the quantity supplied is relatively high. When the price goes down from $1.40 to $1, the quantity supplied decreases from 14 million to 10 million. And when the price goes down further to 60 cents, the quantity supplied is relatively low, 6 million. And again, if we take this supply schedule, plot the points on our supply schedule, fit a curve through it, we're going to get our market supply curve. And in this market, we see that if market forces are operating, the equilibrium price is going to be $1 per pound, and the equilibrium quantity is going to be 10 million. Okay, now if the government imposes a price floor in this market, what we see is, well, okay, what does that mean? It means that this price floor is the minimum price that buyers have to pay. So what it does is it artificially keeps the price of butter or milk artificially high. And when the government does this at this price of $1.20, the quantity demanded from the demand curve is 9 million. The quantity supplied from the supply. So here, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and that is what's known as a surplus. And the surplus is, the magnitude of it is 3 million pounds. So when the government sets a price support for butter, what it does is it generates this surplus of butter. And in the government price support programs, they actually guarantee producers the price of $1.20, and what they have to do is buy up this surplus. And in the milk market, they typically buy up a very large surplus of milk, which is expensive to the government because they have to buy up. In this example, they'd buy 3 million pounds, and they'd have to pay $1.20 a pound. So it's an expensive government program into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And the reason for it is they're trying to provide price supports or income supports for agricultural producers. And the result is this higher price, in this case, for butter. We can analyze the economic efficiency implications of our price floor in agricultural markets. When we establish this price floor, same thing, we wind up with a deadweight loss that's equal to the area of this triangle. In this example, they have simplified the analysis and are saying that at the level of the price floor, the quantity consumed is going to be 8 million based on the demand, private sector demand. And given that the deadweight loss is equal to the orange shaded area, we could extend this analysis to look at the impact of the government actually buying up the surplus, which would change the efficiency implications, but it still would result in economic inefficiency, based on a consumer plus producer surplus calculation. And in the agricultural markets, it's sort of interesting because whenever there's a natural disaster in the U.S., it's the Department of Agriculture is typically providing bricks of cheese to give to people in the distressed areas, and powdered milk and other things. And you ask yourself, well, where did that cheese and powdered milk come from? It actually came from the agricultural price support programs in milk. And because milk can only be stored for a certain period of time, it gets processed into cheese and powdered milk in response to the surpluses generated by the program. And you say, well, why does the government do this? And well, part of the reason is there's agriculture in every state, so there's a very powerful ag lobby. And their argument is, well, over time, in the short run, it may result in higher prices, but over time, it may result in more stable prices for ag commodities. But this, over time, has not happened because the higher price for milk, the price guarantee, provides an incentive for farmers to expand their milk production expand the size of their dairy herds if they're making a profit. If you're making a profit on 100 cows, you can make more profit on 200 cows and even more profit on 300 cows if you're guaranteed a price for milk that gives you a positive profit margin. So over time, the surpluses have tended to get bigger and bigger because the more efficient producers have expanded the size of their dairy herd faster than the demand for milk has increased. The price floors that students are most familiar with are minimum wage laws. The minimum wage sets the minimum price or wage that employers have to pay workers. And here you can see that the United States, the minimum wage is $7.25 per hour. In other countries, such as Australia, the minimum wage is $16 an hour. So the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, is low compared to other industrialized countries. And here they're making the argument, well, does the minimum wage result in, for example, people working under the table and other things? And my argument would be, well, if people are doing that, the reason probably has more to do with employment rules and regulations, not only in the U.S. and other countries, and probably less to do with the actual minimum wage. As my understanding would be that people that were working under the table, in these sort of black market situations, are probably getting paid a wage that is, at or near what the minimum wage is to begin with. Yeah, so in our agricultural price supports, why does the government spend hundreds of millions of dollars on programs to provide price and income guarantees to farmers? And part of it is because of the agricultural lobby is so strong because it has agriculture in every state, and individual consumers probably don't realize that the price of milk and other things might be lower and would be lower without these kinds of price support programs. I left this slide in for partly because students may be looking at internships, and relatively recently the internships have come under scrutiny. When you get a student internship, are you doing busy work that essentially some other corporate person typically would be doing, or are you doing something that is similar to what you would be doing educationally? And does the internship primarily benefit you? You can ask yourself these questions when you're considering internships. A last type of government control that we're going to look at is, instead of controlling price, controlling the quantity of some good or service. In other words, set a limit on the amount that can be produced in a particular market. The most common examples are these taxi licensing or taxi medallion type of problems. So here we have our demand and supply curves for our taxi market. In a particular location, hypothetically, you can view this as sort of a Manhattan situation where the taxis are required to be licensed to have medallions in order to operate. And in this market, we can see that the equilibrium price is going to be $5 per ride, and the equilibrium quantity is going to be 20 million rods if market forces are operating. Okay, now if the government comes in and requires licensing and restricts the number of licenses, the equivalent of 8 million rides per year, this becomes the maximum quantity that can be supplied, giving that licensing arrangement. And you can see that this quantity, some taxi companies would be willing to provide, in other words, the price that the seller would be willing to take would be $4 a ride, but the price that buyers are willing to pay is $6 a ride. And the reason for that is because of the restriction on the quota on the number of cabs that can be placed into service. So you can see this extra $2 per ride can be viewed as an economic rent that accrues to the drivers of taxi cabs. So what it means, it's going to increase their profitability because of the restrictions in supply. And the implication for that in terms of consumer plus producer surplus is this deadweight loss, where we're restricting the quantity, similar to what we did before when we imposed price controls. It restricts the quantity, and at this quantity, buyers are willing to pay more than sellers are willing to take in order to provide the service. And if there wasn't this quota or licensing arrangement, there would be more taxi cab service until those prices were exactly the same. So in terms of total surplus, the quota is going to reduce consumer plus producer surplus, and what it's going to do is provide a much higher price that buyers are going to have to pay, and it's going to increase the profitability of the cab company. And because of that increase in profitability, those rents are what allow the cab company to pay significant amounts of money, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, for these taxi licenses. So you can look at this wedge between the price that buyers are willing to pay and sellers are willing to take as being a rent that accrues to the holder of that license. What incentives does that provide is it provides an incentive for cabs to try to operate without licenses, the quote gypsy cab model, or it provides an opening for companies like Uber, who can argue that rather than being a taxi cab, these are ride-sharing situations, and somehow get around the licensing issues of taxi cabs. And you can see by looking at that graph that when there are those rents, that the Uber could come in there and charge lower fares than the taxi cab companies. So if the cab is trying to charge the maximum price that consumers are willing to pay, it leaves room for Uber to come in and effectively as a way around that quota.